Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'll be discussing the 1928 film White Shadows in the South Seas with my friend Matthew Brady, who writes the War and Peace newsletter. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So before we get into today's film, tell listeners a little bit about who you are and where they can find your work.
Yeah, so my newsletter is just a blog where I write about a lot about the movies that I watch, also about books I read, both prose novels and graphic novels, and other comics, and TV shows I watch too. My main project that I have going on right now is I've been reviewing a lot of blaxploitation movies from the 1970s. So I've been publishing a new review every week of one of those movies. But my newsletter can be found at matthewbrady.substack.com.
Excellent. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And before we get into White Shadows in the South Seas, as I've been doing throughout this season of the Oscars so far, updating our place in history. So our last film was Our Dancing Daughters, which came out at the beginning of September. And this film was in early November. So we've had a couple months pass. So some world events that have been going on. The one that I first caught my eye was September 3rd, was the discovery of penicillin by Scottish biologist Alexander Fleming. Obviously, a bit of a mistake when I guess he left some stuff out while he was away for the weekend or away for a week and came back and, hey, we've got penicillin. There was also a big hurricane that ravaged through Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, and southern Florida, killing almost 3,000 people. In terms of some notable births in that time, Adam West, who would go on to become the TV's Batman, born September 19th of 1928. The other one, November 10th, so the day that this film that we're talking about today was released, was also the birth of Ennio Morricone, who we'll obviously return to later as he was a multiple Academy nominee and winner.
Yes, he's one of the greats.
Yes, yeah. In terms of some other events, obviously we were in an election year, so November 6th was the U.S. presidential election. It was the election of Herbert Hoover as the 31st president of the U.S. And I guess it was one of the most decisive victories ever. It was 444 electoral votes to 87. So we don't see that much anymore today, but it seems like everybody was on Hoover's side that year.
At least at that point.
Yeah, yeah. And in sports, we had a sweep by the New York Yankees over the St. Louis Cardinals in a 4-game series of the World Series. I know that was in the middle of their kind of heyday. The 1927 Yankees are the ones that everybody always talks about, but obviously they had a good team around those times with all the famous names, Babe Ruth and those guys that everybody knows. So they were dominating for sure. And then the other bit that I wanted to mention, because it kind of relates to things that'll come down the road historically in a few years, is also on November 10th, Japanese Emperor Hirohito participated in an enthronement ceremony in Kyoto, Japan. Although he actually, I was reading, he actually took the throne a couple of years earlier when the previous emperor died. But obviously, Hirohito is going to be a big name in world politics for the next decade and a half, at least.
Yes.
Any historical facts you want to add to the record before we move on to the movie?
I didn't find anything especially notable, although I did see that a few people involved in this movie were, they lost a lot of money in the stock market crash that was coming up in 1929. Although that's probably true of a lot of people in the United States at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's move on to the film. White Shadows in the South Seas first appeared in theaters on November 10th, as I mentioned, 1928. It was directed by W.S. Van Dyke from a screenplay by Jack Cunningham and Ray Doyle, with intertitles by John Colton, and was based on the 1919 novel of the same name by Frederick O'Brien.
It stars Monty Blue as Dr. Lloyd, Raquel Torres as Fayaway, and Robert Anderson as Sebastian. Has a running time of 89 minutes and was produced by Cosmopolitan Productions and distributed by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer.
Clyde Davina was the winner for Best Cinematography at the Second Academy Awards, the only nomination that the film received. And there are several versions of the film on YouTube as of this recording, as well as a readily available DVD release of the film. So it's definitely available if folks want to check it out. So we get into the film and we start off with some beautiful shots of these South Pacific islands. They call them the Marquesas.
I would actually go back one little bit because this is an interesting detail that this is one of the first movies with full synchronized sound. And I read that it was the first movie where people actually were able to hear the MGM lion roar at the beginning.
Yes, that's right. That's before you even get the movie to start, we get to see Leo roar, and we actually got to hear him for the first. And I, when I was watching it, I noticed that, and then I saw that note later on as I was researching, and it's like, oh yeah, we can actually hear him now. That's good.
Yeah.
And of course, there's that famous still image of him kind of standing on the podium with the microphone in front of him when they, I guess, were recording that
Oh,
sound.
wow.
I don't know if the sound was recorded with the video or the film of that, but yeah, I'm sure people were surprised to hear a lion roar in the theater when they sat down for this film.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up. When we get into the film, obviously we're in the South Pacific. We get a bunch of shots of kind of these everyday life going on this island. There's some scenes at a bar. There's people with their animals bringing boats into into the shore, things like that. So all these things going on, and we get introduced to our first two main characters, Dr. Matthew Lloyd, who is drunken doctor in this little village, and then Sebastian that you mentioned earlier, who is the kind of the overseer, the prototypical white man plantation owner style character.
Yes. And was it before this point when there were titles sort of introducing the theme of the movie?
Yeah.
Were they about how it seems that specifically the white people, referred to in the title, the white shadows, have come through and basically ruined the lifestyle of the indigenous people in the South Pacific. So we get to see some examples of that right off at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, and from the perspective of the white man, obviously they're saving them in certain terms, but it's obviously completely uprooting their way of life, and we see that throughout the film as a theme that comes back over and over again.
Yeah, and they really hit on it at the beginning with Sebastian. I think one of the first things he does is buys a pearl off of one of the people, and clearly he thinks it's very valuable. And then he convinces the guy to trade him for his wristwatch to give him the pearl.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of taking advantage of those folks going on. And now, we see later in the film that the clams that they're harvesting to, where the pearls come from, they don't see the pearls as valuable. They see the shell as the valuable part because they can use it to make tools and stuff like that.
I also the introduction of the doctor here, of Matthew, when he kind of comes into the bar sort of as a stumbling drunk, but he pulls out his stethoscope and listens to somebody's heart, and he says, "Oh, I can tell you have a heart, so you'll buy me a drink."
Yeah.
Which that was a gag that made me laugh.
And talking about him specifically, obviously he kind of becomes the main character in the whole story, but I really liked his character as a whole, and we see his ups and downs throughout the rest of the story. Obviously, we meet him as a drunk, but then a few scenes later, we get him kicking into doctor mode when there's one of the native divers, I think it's a collapsed lung, something like that,
Yeah.
and they bring him up to the beach and he's trying to save the injured diver. So we see him in drunk mode, we see him in savior doctor mode, and then obviously we see some changes in him going back and forth later on in the film as well.
Yeah, that will be coming up.
So eventually we get a ship that arrives, and there's some men that
If
are
we could
sick
go
with
back,
them.
sorry to derail things again, but I also thought there were some shots there of the indigenous people diving for pearls that were really interesting. There's some underwater photography, which seemed like that was probably not super common at the time, but there were some nice shots of them underwater diving for the pearls. Then some danger when you see a guy get his foot stuck in a big shell, and some other guys have to come and rescue him, and there's some shots of octopus and a shark to sort of indicate danger, although they didn't really endanger him that much. But then when they pull him up, and there's some titles that tell us about the dangers of the getting the bends by going down and coming up too quickly and getting a collapsed lung from the underwater pressure, and that's when Matthew has to revive and perform some treatment on the guy that gets hurt.
Yeah, yeah, no, I thought the all of those shots at in the early portion there, especially the underwater stuff were I was trying to put myself in the time period of watching this in 1928, and somebody sitting in a theater in New York City or Chicago would never have seen anything like that. most likely.
Right.
So it must have been astounding for people to see that.
Did we mention that this was shot on location in Tahiti?
No, we haven't mentioned that yet, but yeah, that's an important point to bring up.
Yeah.
It's not a sound stage or a tank in a back lot. It's all right there. It's all real.
Yeah, all the jungle and the trees and the ocean were all, yeah, the actual South Pacific.
And even obviously it's black and white, and then, some of the shots are kind of grainy, kind of not greatly lit, but it's still beautiful. And again, seeing it in a theater in North America or in England or something, I can imagine it was. People said, "Oh, I wish I could go there. It looks beautiful."
Agree, yeah, and that's I'm sure was the reason it got that cinematography award was people were,
Yeah.
"This is pretty incredible to actually get to see that."
Yeah, I wrote that down, in the first 5-10 minutes, I'm always already saying, "Yep, I don't care what the other films are, this is gonna win cinematography hands down this year." So, yeah, so we get this ship that arrives in the harbor, the lagoon, and that somebody says that there's, men sick on the boat with measles, and so, Mr. Lloyd, the doctor, agrees to go out and try and help them, and I guess it's some I'm doing some reading later, it seems like this was a bit of a ploy on Sebastian's part to get rid of the doctor. I didn't quite make that connection when I was watching it, but he gets the doctor out there and they tie him to the ship's wheel and raise the sails and send the boat off into the ocean to get rid of the doctor.
Yeah, it wasn't fully clear, but they did sort of once the guys basically attacked him and subdued him, it became obvious that this was what the plan was to get rid of this
Yeah.
guy. Because there was a moment earlier after Sebastian saved the guy when he yelled at Sebastian. Sorry, Matthew saved the guy, and he yelled at Sebastian about how you're ruining these people's lifestyle, and it's horrible what you're doing here. So clearly, this guy is a real pain that the rich guy wanted to get rid of.
Yeah, exactly. So he gets sent out into the ocean. We see him end up in a some sort of storm, and he's eventually he somehow gets free from his being tied up to the wheel and is trying to save the ship, which of course ends up being shipwrecked or capsized on some rocks, and he ends up on a faraway beach. He
Yeah.
doesn't know where he is.
The storm was pretty cool. There like the ship itself, you could see that there were some they used a pretty small model that they washed around. But the shots of him actually on the ship with the waves crashing over him were very dramatic. I'm not sure that that could have possibly been something done on a soundstage to fill in, but there was definitely a lot of water being crashed over him and
Yeah,
crashing around. It was another very exciting scene for people at the time, I'm sure.
absolutely. Supporting the cinematography nomination and win there. And if they had a visual effects category back then, I'm sure it would have been top of the list for that as well.
Right, yeah.
He ends up on what initially appears to be a deserted island, but eventually he does find a little hut on the beach and follows some footprints into the forest and runs into some women playing in a waterfall, some indigenous women there. And eventually they see him retreat into the woods, and then pretty
Yeah,
soon
they all kind
a
of run away screaming.
yeah, they run away screaming, and a few moments later, the rest of the tribe comes up and confronts him, and kind of like, "Hey, what you doing? Who are you? What are you doing here?"
Yeah, so there's also some shock. I think the titles tell us at this point that they've never seen anybody with white skin before,
Yeah.
so they're all shocked to see
Yeah.
someone like him.
And they, as we hear a lot of times in situations like this, they, see him as a god. They refer to him multiple times throughout the rest of the story as the white god, a pale skinned god, something of that nature.
Yes, there's a lot of that, which and when we talk about the movie a little later, we can get into those
Yeah, yeah,
themes.
yeah. Obviously, would not fly today, but in 1928, I don't think anyone batted an eye at that sort of talk.
Right.
So they get him back to the village. He kind of gets some oil rubbed on him and gets himself cleaned up. And we that's where we start to meet Fay Away, who is kind of the eventually becomes the love interest here. And they're in the process of planning a giant feast for this white god that they have discovered. And I really like some of those shots too, where we're seeing the goings on of the village. The guys climbing the tree for the coconuts. There's part where they're jumping into the water to capture and kill a sea turtle, octopus, killing, fishing, all of those sorts of things. Are really neat for no real reason, just to see some of those techniques that these people have used for probably hundreds of thousands of years on these
Yes,
islands.
this really seemed to capture that sort of native lifestyle because 'cause they're preparing for a big feast, and yeah, you've seen all the men shimmy up those really tall palm trees so they can, get the coconuts, and, yeah, seeing them all capture the sea turtles, which are this turtle is probably at least 5 feet long. So and then, yeah, all the techniques they use as they're making fire, they're cooking all of the food. Even, I especially liked one where, there was a fish that was being cooked, and they wrapped it in a palm leaf, and somebody sort of braided the different fronds together to make a nice little package to cook it in, and it was a yes, a great example of, just sort of capturing the life of these indigenous people.
Yeah, absolutely. It was something I would have liked more of that. I would have liked almost preferred if this had been more of a documentary and just
Yeah.
dispense with the love story and let's just learn more about these
Right.
people because they're
That was probably
fascinating.
the most interesting parts was
Yeah.
seeing the what life was like.
Right. So we obviously eventually get to the feast. We get obviously they're all eating. There's some dancing going on. I'm not going to try and pronounce the
Oh, right.
indigenous name of this guy, but they call him man with legs like exploding eggs, which I thought was a fantastic description because he does
Yeah.
dance like his legs are crazy.
Yeah, I was unsure how, traditional this dance was, or not, but it was an interesting yeah, really seeing him go to town, on the dance floor. And this was a case where also because of the synchronized sound, they did at least have a little bit of sound on the soundtrack. I'm not sure, I kinda doubt it was recorded at the same time, I think it was something that they filled in later, but there is some sense of actual music while we're watching this. There are the people are gathered around, they're pounding their hands on the ground all together, and that sort of matched up with the beat on the soundtrack as well. The sound itself throughout the movie is kind of rudimentary. There wasn't really any dialogue other than I think maybe one point where somebody shouted hello and they actually fit in a hello on the soundtrack.
Yeah.
For the most part, a lot of the sound was like in crowd scenes, you just sort of heard a general mumbling in the background. But yeah, in this part where they were dancing, you at least kind of got some sense of music playing.
I love the music in all of these dance and the feast scenes. The one other one that I did note down, it was from the very beginning, and I forgot to mention it when it was kind of panning across the village at the very beginning. There was a pig that goes through the scene, and you can kind of hear a pig grunting on the soundtrack. So that was one of the first things I noticed right at the beginning, which was kind of neat. Obviously, again, people are probably more apt to have seen and heard pigs, depending on where they were
Right.
watching it, but neat to
Which,
see that and
again,
hear it.
when sound was such a new technology, just
Yeah.
having a pig come on across the screen and you actually hear a pig was probably exciting for people watching at the time.
Exactly, exactly.
Getting back to the dancing, there is a following up the man with the legs like exploding eggs. There is some more dancing by some of the tribe's women. That part I thought was it seemed a little bit more like Hollywood musical style dancing. They were doing some synchronized shimmying and moving back and forth. They sort of lapse back into more traditional, the type of thing you would see in a movie.
Yeah, for sure. And I kind of as we move into the rest of this feast, eventually Fei Wei, the lead is one of the women who's dancing and starts to do a little bit of catching Matthew's eye, wink wink, hey, I'm kind of into you kind of thing. And when he goes in for, I guess initially just kind of a hug, all of a sudden the whole tribe gets up in arms and he finds out pretty quickly that she is I think the title said the Virgin Bride of the Temple, and
Yes,
no one is allowed to
something
look
like
on
that.
her with eyes of love. So the chief shuts that romance down pretty quickly. Let's see. Some time passes, and eventually we kind of get some more scenes of Fayaway and the doctor kind of flirting a little bit on and off. They're in the forest together, and they hear the birds, and he starts whistling, kind of whistling the bird song, and so he teaches her how to whistle.
Yeah, this was another moment that was some synchronized sound. But it went on for a very long time of him whistling and her being completely flabbergasted at this at him being able to do this as and he eventually teaches her how to do it. So, it was, one of those bits where this movie was probably a little longer than it needed to be, and that was one moment where, I was kinda going, "Okay, we get the idea. She's
Yeah.
learning to whistle."
Yeah, and we'll get to it at the end when we kind of go over our final thoughts. But one of the things that I did downgrade this a little bit was on the editing because some of these scenes are a little bit drawn out. Obviously, some of the stuff is great, the documentary type stuff that we talked about a few minutes ago, but there are some scenes where it's just like, okay, we get it. Let's move on.
Yeah.
So as they're together in the woods, we then learn that there's somebody from the village who has been, they say, has been killed in the sea. And we see it's the young boy that was we see seen a little bit earlier trying to steal some food during the feast, and eventually come to learn that this is Fei Wei's little brother. And of course, Lloyd is a doctor, so he tries to step in and help save this young boy. And unfortunately, he's not able to, but eventually he decides to give it one more go and is able to save the boy's life, which, of course, now everyone in the village is completely in love with him. And basically, he's kind of the savior in the village now. And that kind of
Yeah.
I think reinforces their view of him as the white god.
Yes. Yeah, that was another scene that was kind of drawn out where partly it was interesting just because this was well before CPR was invented. And so seeing him, he wasn't doing any chest compressions or any mouth to mouth. He was just sort of rubbing the boy's chest. And eventually that was enough to bring him back to life, which I'm not sure why it didn't work the first time. And so they had all started crying because he was dead. And then he said, well, I'm going to give it another go. And this time it worked.
Yeah, so they adopt him as a chieftain, says one of the titles, and they name him Mataloa, based on his English name Matthew Lloyd, and so he kind of insinuates himself into the tribe and is learning a lot of their ways. And this was kind of the next part where we got to see a little bit more of that kind of documentary style of storytelling, where he's watching them make their tools and all sorts of things. And this is where a little bit of the conflict comes in.
They also said the chief said the restriction on his daughter's virginity, I guess, or it
Yes.
is lifted. So
Yep.
you can now romance her.
So that obviously frees the way for that part of the story, and which of course he takes full advantage of right away. So he in this scene of them kind of going through their daily lives, we see one of the men in the village working on a clamshell, and he's making fish hooks out of the clamshell, like we mentioned earlier, and takes a pearl out of the clamshell and just tosses it to the side. And of course, this ignites a memory in the doctor's mind, and he thinks that he can collect some of these pearls and kind of redeem himself with the rest of the white men.
Yes, says the spark of greed was ignited.
Coming back to that theme that we saw at the beginning there. So he starts, I guess, diving himself for the clams. And I can't remember if I think we do get to see a couple shots of him underwater grabbing the shells.
I think so. Yes,
So we get a few more shots like that.
and the indigenous people, they make some comments along to each other of he's just getting these worthless pearls and he's not using the shells or anything. It's
Yeah.
a complete waste.
So they're getting very suspicious of him. And then we have another encounter with him and Fayaway, where they have a first kiss during this encounter. And there's another title, something about he's still only a white man, and he holds the world in his palm, obviously referring to the pearls. And that night he goes up to the mountaintop and makes a fire, of course, using the techniques that he's learned from the villagers,
Yes.
and just trying to get the attention of any passing ships to kind of bring some more white men to the island so that he can get away and offer up some of the pearls that he's found there.
Yeah, so this is when she comes and begs him to saying, "What it?" I forget if she said anything something along the lines of, "Am I not good enough for you?" or "Is this not a happy life that we have together?"
Yep. She brings him back.
Yeah, he sort of comes to his senses and realizes
Yep. Comes to senses. They put out the fire.
throwing away this idyllic existence that I have.
And we get the I think there was a title that kind of said, yeah, everything's back to the way that they wanted it to be, but the white plague is never far away, kind of thing. We see a
Yes,
single flare from a ship go into the sky, and firework explodes.
right. Which was a nice shot. He'd kind of given up all of his ambitions. He threw the collection of pearls he had back into the ocean. He threw the fire away to remove the signal fire, and then they kind of sat down together nicely on the beach. So it's kind of a nice peaceful moment after all this drama, and then in the background you see a flare go up, which was
Yep.
kind of a nice little indication of, well, he may have changed his mind, but it was probably too late.
It's a little too late, yeah. So, he wakes up the next morning, and of course, there is a boat in the lagoon, a ship that is that probably was the one that released the flare. And of course, villagers have never seen a ship like this, so they come rushing out into the water, and doctor's trying to warn them, no, don't even talk to these guys. They're evil, and of course, they don't
Yeah,
listen.
I think they say something along the lines of, "We've accepted you.
Yeah.
You're a great addition to our community. Here's some more. This is just more of you."
Yeah, they don't quite understand, and of course, he's absolutely right. It is, Mr. Sebastian is on the ship, and you can see the gleam in his eye as soon as he sees the pearl, I think, on the neck of one of the women who ends up on the boat.
Yeah, he does the same trick where he trades her, I forget if it was a ritual wristwatch or if he had a stopwatch this time, but
Yeah.
he, pulled that same trick of, "Oh, let me trade this amazing piece of technology that you've never seen before."
I'm gonna give you this TikTok, I think he calls it.
Yes.
So we get a handshake between the chief and Sebastian, and Sebastian's already talking about he's going to have a store set up on the beach by the next day, selling the fabrics and things that he's bringing with him, and start to trade for the pearls. So his mind's already, the wheels are turning. He's got grand plans within 5 minutes of setting foot on this beach.
Yes, another chance for profit.
Exactly. So Lloyd obviously tries to intervene and ends up getting shot. I couldn't tell if it was by Sebastian or one of the other crew of the
I
boat.
think he was one of his men because, when that happened, all of the tribes people went running in
Yeah, the
terror,
scatter.
he said, "Oh, you couldn't you have used a knife? That now you've scared them all off."
Yeah. So he gets shot. Doctor gets shot and kind of staggers his way back to the village, and where Fayaway and the little brother bring him into their hut, and they try and save him, but unfortunately he ends up dying that night. And then at the very end, we see Sebastian in front of his new store that he's set up, and we see kind of the islanders, moving around. They're wearing the clothes made out of the fabric. They're smoking the cigarettes that he's brought with him. They're enjoying the bar that he's already got running. So Sebastian has won in this case, and
Yes, he's already brought them low down to the level. He's already commenced with ruining everything.
yeah, and I think it's the very last shot, or the last a couple shots, is Fayaway kind of up on that mountaintop of the beach, where they had that last romantic encounter by the fire, and she's even dressed in a more Western style dress, but she's obviously thinking back on Lloyd, who is obviously now gone.
Yeah, she sort of collapses into a heap of sorrow as the movie basically fades out, and ends.
Very much a cautionary tale, and not the way I think a lot of Hollywood movies of the time probably were allowed to end, but
Yeah, I don't know. It does seem like I've seen a few dramas from. I haven't seen a whole lot of the silent dramas, but it does seem like there are at least some that were they could just end it as tragedies, which I don't know if we see that as much these days. I think sometimes you would end with that you'd have a story that was a perhaps also something like this is a cautionary tale, and in a real negative way to leave people it instead of, going out with a happy ending, it definitely ended sad, and I don't know if that's something we see as much anymore, but, I thought that was interesting, yeah.
so, I want to move into just kind of talking about the folks involved. Obviously, we've kind of touched on some of them throughout the discussion so far. Starting off with the director. Well, there's technically actually two directors I was reading. So Robert Flaherty was the kind of initial director and ended up leaving the project due to some disagreements. He had previously directed Nanook of the North, as well as a documentary called Moana, not to be confused with the Disney films, which also obviously was filmed in the South Pacific. So he had some experience in that. And then W.S. Van Dyke, who's mainly credited with directing the film, took over from there. So two directors involved, but mainly it was Van Dyke, from my understanding, that finished the film.
Yeah, I think I had read that Van Dyke was known more as like, he very efficient director. He would do just one take and say, "That looks good." And, so for a production like this where they've shipped everything over to Tahiti and are shooting in an unfamiliar location, that was probably somebody who could cut costs like that was
Yeah.
much more preferable to the studio.
Yeah, and I also saw that he kinda had a vision in his mind of every shot, every angle that he needed ahead of time, so, again, was very efficient with what he needed to do. I'm just thinking of those shots of the guys climbing the trees to get the coconuts and stuff, like,
Right.
they're all very synchronized climbing up the tree, so he's like, "Okay, go," and that's probably the one or 2 shots that he got of that sequence. I also saw that he worked as an assistant director on Birth of a Nation with D.W. Griffith, which actually I also saw Monty Blue, who played Dr. Lloyd. His first film appearance was in Birth of the Nation as a stuntman. And who's the other one? Robert Anderson, who played Sebastian, was also he worked with as a makeup artist with Griffith on his follow-up to Birth of a Nation called Intolerance. So a couple D.W. Griffith connections there in this cast and crew. Anything else to add on the directors?
I don't think so. Were you going to mention the writing? I know this was based on. Did you see who was the one who wrote the original book?
Frederick O'Brien was the author of the book. It's a novel from 1919.
Yes, and from what I'd read about that is, it was much more of a travelogue book than an actual narrative, and it was really focused on that sort of the influence that the colonialist, white European American people have had, throughout the South Pacific, and how he was very critical of the way that they had sort of ruined a lot of the native people's lives during their pursuit of riches. But yeah, that apparently it was a very popular book, which is just something that was interesting because before movies like this became actually showed people footage of all of this. That was the way a lot of people sort of experienced travels around the world was somebody writing a very flowery description of everything they saw when they visited these lands.
Yeah, and there's actually a version of a copy, I suppose, of the book is available online on the Project Gutenberg website. I believe it's the full text of the book. I don't know. I did start reading a little bit of it, and it was the first several chapters are very more kind of set up and not getting into the whole politics or themes of the film. But it's interesting to read that, and I wondered a little bit of how like, obviously, we've seen pictures of Tahiti, and you see ads for cruises and things like that of these places, so we kinda know what it looks like, but I tried to imagine somebody, going back to some lady sitting in a study in New York City. What are they imagining in their mind as they're reading some of these descriptions of these far-flung places?
Yeah, it had to be the way a lot of people did get any sort of experience of things other than what they see on their normal lives. But yeah, movies like this really changed that, I think.
Yep, really
I,
opened up
I was
the
thinking about that too.
possibilities.
How that was a big selling point for a lot of movies for a long time. Was here's footage of these places around the world, and that nowadays that has basically become the remit of nature documentaries and the like. So you might see stuff on the Nature Channel or but every so often you'll get a movie that is actually shot in this place and it comes up with things that few people have seen and but yeah, that definitely seems much less common nowadays because back then that was could be the entire selling point was look at this place that you would never ever be able to experience in your lifetime.
Yeah, and also thought it was interesting. So John Colton, who did the titles for the film, was also involved in adapting the short story Rain into a play, which then served as the basis for the 1928 film Sadie Thompson, which I covered previously on the podcast. Also set in the South Pacific on some of these islands. Completely different type of story, but interesting that he was involved in two stories that both take place in the same area of the world.
Yeah, that is interesting.
And I remember when I talked about that film, I don't remember if I mentioned it on podcast or not, but I did a little bit of digging into how long it would take to go between these islands 100 years ago. And, it was obviously days between some of these islands that were close to each other, but weeks, if not months, to get from the west coast of the US out to Tahiti or Fiji or places like that. So
I imagine, yeah.
obviously, we don't get a lot of that in this film or in this story, but these islands are so small and so remote. It's almost a miracle that anybody ever found some of them.
Yeah.
So the actors, really, it's the main three. Monty Blue is Dr. Lloyd, Raquel Torres is Fayaway, and Robert Anderson is Sebastian. Again, I already mentioned Monty Blue is in Birth of a Nation. He was, you mentioned at the beginning, he was one of the ones that lost a lot of his wealth in the stock market crash, but was able to kind of rebuild from what I read, being a character actor throughout the rest of his career.
Yeah, I thought he was very good, as we mentioned how he played that well as the sort of idealistic type, both being kind of broken down as a somebody who had fallen on addiction,
Mhm.
fallen on hard times, and was really upset about everything he saw going around him, but then getting sort of a new lease on life by discovering these people. He handled that well enough. I know a lot of as you've talked about some of these movies, the acting styles, everybody had to be so much more expressive back then without sound. So a lot of it is kind of overacting, but I think it was just what was necessary at the time of like trying to really express things through their facial expressions. But he did yeah, a good job of sort of portraying his character's journey from both being washed up and broken and then regaining his joie de vivre and then becoming consumed with greed and then renouncing it, but then had seen everything sort of fall apart around him. He handled that well.
Yeah, I thought his character, like I said at the top, his character arc was the best and one of the better ones that I've seen in these films of this time period, where you do get several ups and downs throughout the story with his character.
Yeah, a lot of these stories like this are fairly simplistic, especially
Yeah.
one with like this where I think they had the travelogue structure of the original book, so trying to come up with a story that fit in. But it worked well enough for what it is. It's just it's always interesting to look back at these movies from 100 years ago and see what they came up with of the just yeah, a very simple drama without too much complexity.
And kind of brings us to Raquel Torres as Fay. She was actually a Mexican actress, and obviously that was oftentimes a fill-in for anyone of exotic type heritage. Was Mexicans, I think, were oftentimes used in that respect. I saw a note that she was the first person to have her voice recorded as part of kind of a audition process as we were moving into sound pictures. There's a little clipping that I found online and from the Los Angeles Times, I think it was, and it's a picture of her standing in front of a microphone being recorded as an audition for a movie part.
Yeah, I was gonna say I do think they darkened her skin for the movie to make her look a little more indigenous. It did definitely seemed like her skin was just a little bit unnaturally darker than it would have been. Really made her teeth stand out, look especially white. So that is one of those things that definitely is not unheard of at the time. It would have been amazing if they could have found an actual indigenous actress, but I think that would have just there was nobody that actually was doing something like that in the 1920s. I don't believe.
Yeah, and obviously, the bulk of the other people in the film are people from the island of Tahiti, presumably, since that's where they were filming. So they used a lot of the folks that were already there. But obviously, for the main characters, you do need someone who can do a little bit more acting. The other main character, obviously, is Robert Anderson as Sebastian. He's a Danish-born actor. Mentioned his work with Griffith as well. Didn't really find too much on him. I guess he did retire. He made a couple of sound movies, but retired in 1934, so only a couple of years after this film was released.
And there wasn't a whole lot to him. He was basically the villain that
Yep,
he really
very
only had
one
was
note.
in a few scenes, but he played his part well enough as the greedy rich guy who is
Yeah,
there just to make everyone else's life worse.
and obviously we've talked about the story quite a bit. Production was done in Tahiti, and we talked about the sound as well. The one note I had too was there was obviously no concerns for animal welfare on this production.
Oh yeah,
We were way before those times. We've got the pigs running around. Obviously, we've got the clams.
and those
I don't know
turtles.
if those are protected on yeah, the turtles. So there's plenty of things that people would object to nowadays that were not considered as taboo at the time.
Right.
Let's see, we talked about Leo the Lion. Any reviews that you were able to find from the time period?
I didn't really. I think I'd seen some. I glanced some over, but I didn't find anything too notable. It sounded like people liked thought the probably similar to what we're saying, where the visuals were really impressive, but the story was fairly rudimentary.
Yeah, the two ones that I wrote down, Motion Picture Magazine, it was a picture ravishing to the eye and appealing to the heart. And then Film Spectator said, nothing finer than white shadows in the South Seas has ever come to the screen. I think that's a
Oh, wow.
little bit too much praise.
Yes.
Maybe they're just talking about the visuals, but you're absolutely right. It's from the ones I saw, it seemed that they really liked what they saw, but not so much necessarily the story.
The other thing I don't know if I mentioned is, at least in the version I saw, it seemed like they had some colored tinting to the picture.
Yeah.
So the during the night, it would, night scenes, you'd usually be tinted blue. And then, like, when he woke up on the island after the shipwreck, everything had kind of a yellowish tint to sort of really show the brightness, the sunny location.
Yeah.
So they're definitely, I think that is something that you probably see in some of these older movies, but not always.
Yeah, and I did note too at the very end, that sequence that we talked about towards the end where, Sebastian is standing out in front of the new store, and we see the new establishments there. I noticed that that was straight black and white. There was no tinting at that point, and definitely I think a commentary on, we've gone to a completely black and white world. There is no color there. It's bleak
Yeah,
and stark at
this
this
is the
point.
darkness that is
Yeah.
overcome.
At the Oscars, as we mentioned at the top, White Shadows in the South Seas won the award for Best Cinematography. It was nominated against The Divine Lady, Four Devils, In Old Arizona, Our Dancing Daughters, and Street Angel. So we're going to cover most of those on the podcast, or have already. Again, I haven't seen all of them yet because I'm still working my way through the season, but I don't think anything's going to top this in terms of cinematography. I can't see how you could at that time.
Right.
So, anything else you wanna mention, before we get on to some final thoughts and some ratings?
I would just, yeah, say analysis of the movie would be, I was worried going in that this was going to be somewhat racist. I think just I looked at the title and I kind of was like, oh boy, white people in the South Seas, what sort of thing. You never know in older movies when they're gonna take a real racist turn. You'll have somebody show up in blackface or something like that. But then, like, first thing it started, it kind of, those intertitles right away were, the South Seas, the South Pacific here in Polynesia has really been ruined by the white colonialists, which I thought was a very interesting, kind of a progressive way of, approach to take to this type of story. I wasn't expecting them to be really pointing out the damage that colonialism, has had as richer cultures kind of come in and just extract the resources and the riches,
Yeah.
and also sort of ruin other people's lives. So that was a I like that was a approach. But then the movie kind of switched into that sort of, with this idea that the white people are the ones that are causing the problems, it still sort of unironically had Matthew presented as the white god,
Yeah.
and the natives that he met, they're treated as sort of these backward savages. So even if the movie is critical of white people, it still kind of takes a bit of a paternalistic, stance toward them, as, oh well, these, like, the best thing it can seem to say about him is that really didn't really treat them as fully human. There was still sort of a curiosity, these sort of backwards people that need to be protected, rather than actually being humans that should have equal rights to as everyone else. So that was a bit disappointing, but again, that's probably of the time. That's
Right.
the sort of thing you're going to get. But I would even think that, a lot of the elements that we pointed out are the things that would be counter to that attitude of really seeing these people's way of life, the way they've mastered their land, and they've come up with all these cultures and customs of being able to really thrive as they make use of all the resources around them, and live these, incredible lives. The movie itself, what we see sort of is a bit counter to that idea that they're sort of these backwards, uncivilized people.
Yeah.
So, that's the 21st century view of this, I'd say, where we kind of, it's nice to recognize that there were some positive aspects, but, definitely a little bit backwards in its way, the movie's way of thinking about these topics.
Yeah, I think that the areas where I had to downgrade the movie is in that story, in that presentation of the material, but on the positive side, the visuals were outstanding. We talked about the cinematography at length, the camera shots, the underwater imagery, all that stuff was excellent, and to a certain extent, the innovative use of sound at this point in time. Again, trying to watch it
Yes.
from that time period's perspective, at least as far as that goes, So if I'm giving it a rating as we move on to that, I actually gave it a 7 out of 10. I was again kind of down on the story, like we've talked about, but I think some of those technical aspects for me did, save it a little bit, despite the problems that we talked about with the presentation and the story itself.
I think I was thinking about I'd probably go with about a 6. That's it's hard to tell with ratings. I'm not super focused on number ratings, but yeah, I think that's where I landed.
Yeah, some of the online IMDb and Letterboxd and places, it's somewhere in the 6 to 7 range. Seems about pretty standard for folks on this movie. Well, I will be sure to include a list of resources and links to the articles and reviews that we mentioned in the episode, as well as a link to where you can watch White Shadows in the South Seas online or purchase a copy for yourself if you're so inclined. Matthew, I want to thank you again for coming on the show to talk about this film and remind people where they can find your work one more time.
Yes, it is. MatthewBrady.substack.com is where you can find me.
And don't forget to follow the Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And be sure to come back for next Friday's episode of the Oscar Project podcast, where I will be discussing the film A Woman of Affairs. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the movies.